Okay, we're back. So we're going to talk about the progressive era and these four different phases of the progressive eras, of the changes that occur and who's making those changes. So there's going to be four phases. We're going to go through all four. The first will be these individuals and private organizations. We'll talk about them. The second will be local governments. The third will be state governments. And the fourth will be the national government. So we're going to start small and work to the federal level, from individuals and private organizations through local governments, state governments, and then federal governments. So I want to start with the individuals and private organizations. And I want to start by making sure that you understand that the progressive era wasn't just in the United States. So often we learn about American history kind of in a bubble, like it just happened all by itself. But in reality, the progressives were ongoing in Europe as well, especially in England. So many of the people that we learn about in this time period had learned their ideas or had actually been in England learning some of these different ideas, whether it's suffragists fighting for women's right to vote or others. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But I wanted you to understand this is a global phenomena. It's not just an American phenomena. It wasn't even necessarily an American idea first. It was around the world. Because think about it, you've got industrialization and urbanization ongoing in cities around the world, especially European countries. And so they're going to have a lot of the same problems that the United States does. The American situation was exacerbated a little bit by the fact that we have millions of immigrants coming in, and so the cities get a little bit more crowded more quickly. Okay, so these individuals and private organizations that are going to lead this progressive movement and progress towards change, hopefully for the better. And the one group your textbook author talks about a lot, and is maybe the easiest to point to, are journalists, and they are given a nickname by Theodore Roosevelt, and they're called muckrakers. Muckrakers. So Theodore Roosevelt names them, and remember, this is the time before the automobile is popular, so everybody's on horses and carriages and things like that. And so horses, you know what they do, right? In the middle of the road, they stop in the middle of the road and take care of their business. And that gets mixed up with the dirt of the roads and the mud of the roads when it rains. And it's just a bunch of muck, right? Just muck, dirt and manure and just blah, right? And so Theodore Roosevelt talks about them as muckrakers. They're out there and they're digging in the nasty, showing all the ugliness of life. And that's really what these journalists do, is they are really an early version of investigative journalists. They go and they see a problem and they focus public attention on these problems, whether it's social problem, economic problem, political injustices, whatever it is. They're going in there and they're digging out the ugliest and nastiest and smelliest problems and bringing them to light so the American people can see them and hopefully fix them, the different problems for them. So there's different journalists. We're going to talk about a few as we go through these things. Ida Tarbell was a woman journalist who exposed the Standard Oil Trust and the problems with that. Lincoln Steffens pushed for urban political reform. Jacob Riis, which I'll show you some pictures a little bit later. That's how you spell his last name. Jacob Riis goes and he's a photographer, a little different than a journalist, print journalist, but he's a photographer, goes and takes pictures of urban life and realities and the tough times that they were having in the cities and stuff. So, you've got all sorts of things being investigated here by these journalists: child labor, migrant ghettos, the waste of natural resources, the subjugation of women, just anything bad or unpleasant that was going on in the world. They were writing about it, and they were selling newspapers doing it because people wanted to learn about these stories. So this was one group, these muckrakers, these journalists. another group the social gospel movement, right? Social gospel movement. And, when you're taking notes, obviously this is recorded and you can just back and forward and all of that. But if you're in a regular classroom, um, it's hard to sometimes write everything the professor is saying. One of the tricks I learned when I was in college, I guess, was I would take the vowels out, right? It's like a vanity license plate. So this is movement, right? MVMT. I could add the N, I guess, but movement, right? Manager is going to be MGR, or just take the vowels out and imagine it's a vanity license plate or something like that, and that can help give you your own shorthand. So the social gospel movement. This social gospel movement is a real shift in Protestant churches, right? You've got this growing number of Protestant churches. Remember, we talked about the growth of churches among African Americans, post-slavery, post-Civil War, but others as well, these Protestant churches around the United States. And they had a real shift in their thinking where, as we talked about earlier, if people were poor, the idea was God was punishing them, things like that. And in this era, this late 1880s, 1890s, turn of the century, pastors began to recognize the social problems around them. This idea that maybe it wasn't the people's fault, maybe it wasn't a punishment from God, and maybe it's our responsibility as Christians to help them and help get them out of their trouble and on their feet again so they can move forward. And so you see this real shift in tone among the pastors of these Protestant churches that kind of followed this social gospel movement, where they would socialize their speeches, socialize their talks. These churches became sources of activism and social activism. You have different groups that come out of this social gospel movement. The Salvation Army. You guys all know the Salvation Army, right? They've got the red buckets at Christmas, and everybody donates the little red buckets and the ringing bell. We've got a Salvation Army location on McKinney, I guess. McKinney and Woodrow, I think. McKinney and Woodrow is across the street there, and it's a homeless shelter that's open in the evenings for people to stay. So the Salvation Army is this old organization. It starts in England in the 1880s and then comes to the United States with this idea of an army. The Lord's Army is there to help people in need. Other organizations, the United Way, the YMCA, and this starts in the 1880s. You guys know what YMCA stands for, right? It's not the song I won't sing, right? But YMCA is the Young Men's Christian Association. They actually had YWCAs too. And what they would do, where today often it's thought of as, public facilities for sports or working out or whatever, the YMCA would set up in different urban areas and have rooms for rent. So people who came to the city, and you have millions of young people who are coming to the cities to find jobs in this era, and they would have a place to stay and have a kind of like a youth hostel today. If you go to Europe and you stay in a youth hostel, the same kind of thing, only with a Christian bent to it, and gender segregated, right? The YWCA, YMCA. But these organizations were there, and they were based in this greater idea of movement, right? And again, it was the idea that poverty and ignorance and even criminality were all effects of an unhealthy environment, not because the individual was flawed or sinful, but because their environment was unhealthy and led them to that poverty, led them to that criminality. The idea that if your children are crying of hunger, you're going to steal a loaf of bread. If your children are hungry, you're going to steal a loaf of bread. to feed them, and that's criminality, right? If you're thieving. So you have other ideas that come out of this kind of this individual organizations. Let me pause a minute and erase the board here. Okay, so settlement houses is this other group that helped, and what these were is these are homes. They were begun by Lillian Ward. Jane Addams with two D's is the most famous of this across the United States. But it's an idea of homes that they would have in the middle of urban areas, in the middle of the poorest areas, that would provide shelter, they would provide food, they would provide medical attention, language opportunities for immigrants. The Hull House, you may have heard of that. The Hull House in Chicago, 1889, with Jane Addams, one of the very worst parts of the cities, but it really helped a lot of people. So by the 19-teens, there were hundreds of these houses across the United States, again, in the urban areas primarily, and all supplied by private individuals, right? These are private individuals. These are going to be young women mainly working in these houses. Eleanor Roosevelt worked in a settlement house. Amelia Earhart, excuse me, worked in a settlement house when she was young as well. So you've got a lot of these homes that are run during this period. And a lot of these are going to be run by women. So women are going to be running these settlement houses. Women are going to be an active part in the progressive movement. And you've got this whole women's movement that is going on and is very active in this time period as well. So I want to talk about that just a little bit. Women are having the opportunity to be more professional. Their work is still very limited in what they can do. They can primarily be teachers. They can be nurses. The nurses of this era, of the turn of the century, early 20th century, are really more what we would think of as aides today. They're going to be doing the cleaning up and things like that. They're not going to be giving the medicine as often. They're not going to be doing any procedures or things like that. It's a very different field than it is today. Today it's such a professional field. But this is a great opportunity. You do have some women able to enter different professions, women going to college. 5% of all medical doctors at this time were women. That number stays steady at 5% through the 1960s, just so you know. None of those numbers would change. And that's in part because the medical schools were reluctant to admit women, but then if they did, the hospitals where you needed to do internships and that kind of thing, residencies, they didn't admit the women because, of course, the women were just going to get married and have babies and quit, so why waste the space? And that argument held through the 1960s and 1970s. Today, women are a much higher percentage of doctors, but in this time period, they were only 5%. And it lasted till the modern women's movement. Right. But if you think about the professions that were available to women in this time period, there were professions, but they were mostly those helping professions, right? They were the nurses, they were the teachers. Women were something like 90% of teachers. They were the majority of librarians, that type of thing as well. Those helping professions, right? So you could work in the factory, or you could work in one of these helping professions. Remember, teachers were fired the minute they got married, because you couldn't have a woman who was married as a teacher. So this was non-threatening for these women to be in these roles. They were domestic images. You of course have the suffrage movement. Suffrage, of course, is the right to vote. This is a movement that had been going on for decades. You have a lot of the women who were part of the abolition movement working to end slavery, who fought alongside. And when that right to vote comes across for African American men that gender was left out. And many of these women were very disappointed with those post Civil War amendments because women were left out. So black men gained the right to vote, but not black women and not white women and not any women in the United States. So you see a real push starting in the 1870s towards women getting the right to vote, a very much more aggressive campaign to try to get the right to vote. Your textbook talks about this some, and I'm going to reference some videos for you and some images in a PowerPoint. But this idea of how do you justify giving women the right to vote? The idea was that politics were dirty and women shouldn't be outside of their sphere of influence. They had the home sphere, that was the political sphere. And that one of the arguments was held that women would make the world safe because women would never vote for war. Women would bring their gentler and more virtuous nature to politics and help politics improve. There were some women who argued that you needed to give women the vote, particularly white women the vote, because then they could counter the vote of black men and of immigrant men. So there was a racist element to this. You do have black suffragists as well, black women who are fighting for the right to vote as well. But that movement really did have a racial split, especially in the later years. As women became more and more desperate for the vote, they pulled out the, watch out for the immigrants, watch out for the black men. Various states give women the right to vote over time. 39 of the states by 1919 had some votes, but finally in 1920 the 19th Amendment is passed. And this is where women get the right to vote. I hope that everybody is voting this year. We're in the 100th anniversary of this. I'm going to, again, be sending you some materials, adding some materials that are available about this. But this is a big deal for women to finally have the chance to vote. And we'll talk about it more when we get to the 1960s and 1970s. There were other groups of people as well that were very active in the progressive movement. You've got the women who were fighting for the right to vote. You also have African Americans that are fighting for civil rights and civil liberties. Remember, this is a period right after the end of the Civil War, right after Reconstruction. We're talking about the 1880s, 1890s, 19 teens. This is all fresh. And the idea of freedom is something that is growing, and what is freedom and what is equality and what are rights. So you have a number of African Americans that fight for progress for black Americans, different individuals. Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois are the most well-known. They didn't necessarily get along. They had different ideas. Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute, and his idea was, black Americans needed to better themselves and improve themselves, and then they would be accepted by whites and be able to take their place in society. Or Du Bois had a different view. His idea was you don't focus on all black Americans. You focused on that talented 10th, right? That top 10%. You give them the very best education, the very best opportunity, and then they will rise, uplift everyone else along with them. He wanted a full university education for that talented 10th. He wanted full civil rights, and he wanted those civil rights now, not to wait, but to have them now. Du Bois and others founded the NAACP. In 1909. Right? So when you think about the NAACP and all the work that it does today, all the work that it did in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, this is a progressive organization. This is an organization that was formed in this time period and pushed for this. Another really important person that I want to make sure you know, and she kind of crosses, she's a muckraker and a part of this talented 10th, and was a co-founder of the NAACP, and that is Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was a prominent writer in this time period. She first got really active and vocal in this period, a great civil rights activist, when three of her good friends were lynched. And lynching is a very serious problem in this time period, which we'll talk about in a later lecture. But lynching is a very serious problem. And Wells talked about it. And she talked very clearly about it and very openly about it, and aggressively about lynching and other violence that was ongoing. And so you've got these individuals that are speaking up and forming organizations that we still have today. One other group I want to touch on, this kind of individual group, is let me erase. So this other group is the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and this is a group of women who formed this organization. They were one of many organizations that were for temperance, which is not drinking, right? To prohibit alcohol. This was their goal. And we'll talk more about this as we hit the 1920s and when Prohibition is finally passed. But this organization was founded in 1873. The Anti-Saloon League joins them in 1893, and they begin this huge push for the prohibition of alcohol, with the argument, of course, that it's bad for families, it's bad for individuals, and again, we'll talk about that when we get to the 1920s. But around the same time as the women's vote that gets passed, the 18th Amendment. Gets passed in 1920 as well, which of course is the prohibition of alcohol. Okay, so these are that first part, those first piece of this progressive era, when you've got these individual organizations, individual people that are really pushing for change, and they're making that change, and they're making the government sit up and take notice, and the laws will come. And that's what we'll talk about in the next little video. It'll be shorter, I promise.